Welcome to an introduction to economics, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. For more information about Parkbench Tutors, please visit parkbenchtutors.com. This podcast is the last in the series on the public sector and explores the relationship government policy has had with industry during a part of the post-war period. Government policy has been concerned with both the private sector and those industries that are, or have been at some point, under the control of the state, and are frequently referred to as nationalized industry. The effect of policy can be broadly grouped into two categories. Legislation that has been designed to control industry is termed negative public policy, whilst initiatives designed to promote innovation and development are termed positive public policy. In particular, we shall look at the government intervention that included nationalization and then the policy of privatization. Why should there need to be any government intervention if we believe in a free market to ensure competition? Well, here is just one reason. Over the past 100 years, the production in the United Kingdom has become concentrated in fewer and fewer firms. The point is not that the number of businesses is decreasing, which is not so, but that the top few businesses have a much larger share of the market. In simple terms, we continue to see the emergence of monopolies and oligopolies. Successive governments have resorted to legislation to try and ensure competition is kept healthy. In a previous podcast, we mentioned that the outcome of a monopoly tended to be above normal profits, higher prices, and a lower output. Some legislation tries to limit the formation and control the activities of monopolies. This includes the Acts of 1948 and 1965. Originally defined as a situation where a third of the market share was under its control, the more recent legislation defines a monopoly as having 25% or more of the market. A commission is supposed to determine whether mergers that might lead to a monopoly are in the public interest. But a proposed merger first has to be referred to the commission. It is easy to see that this has attracted criticisms for its vague terms of reference. Attempts to prohibit or limit restrictive practices have been better received, and many changes were made voluntarily by businesses. Even so, early attempts seem more inclined to set precedents for loopholes than to tighten up and promote competition. One of the most successful pieces of legislation was the abolition of resale price maintenance, which limited competition by determining a price below which a good could not be sold. However, even with the subsequent passing of the Competition Act, there are questions that are asked about restrictive practices in refusal to supply. The impact of negative policy, then, has been rather mixed. Whilst there was success in removing many restrictive practices, the question of mergers remains a controversial issue. In the late 1960s, we saw refusals to allow mergers of banks on the grounds that it would reduce competition. In the last few years, we have seen mergers of banks allowed to prevent collapse of some institutions. What should be allowed under the guise of being in the public interest is more than vague. Should mergers be deemed acceptable in a time of financial crisis because there are claims that jobs are saved? Or should inefficient firms be allowed to fail? In 1980, the activities of monopolies, including state monopolies, has been reviewed. Whilst this has led to some positive action, including action to promote competition and protect consumers, it can be argued that too much government tampering in nationalised or public-owned industry has inhibited development. The activity of governments in supporting initiatives designed to promote growth and restructure industry have also been much discussed as to whether they benefit or prohibit development. Few would argue regional assistance at a time when a large industry was contracting was a waste of money. When large numbers of mines were closed, there was a need to retrain a sizable workforce. In contrast, it is possible to argue that the National Enterprise Board, when it was in existence, having the power and funds to take a stake in private firms, was a form of public ownership that was not desirable. Pouring public funds into the automotive industry to rescue British Leyland proved to be an enormous failure, the firm eventually going out of business. In contrast, Given the massive funding needed to develop new technologies in the aircraft industries, it could be argued that government assistance has allowed that industry to continue. There is also a question of whether a government should assist in development if other countries are assisting their firms. Competition is not only internal. The failure to recognise the competition in the motorcycle industry led to the complete demise of the industry in the United Kingdom, with perhaps too little in the way of assistance from public funding. There is some agreement on providing support for the private sector. We can sum these up as saying that support is considered positive when it assists research and development, when it promotes technology, when it supports small businesses, for retraining the workforce, to promote regional development, and for defence. A firm that is in public ownership is said to be a nationalised industry. A list of industries that have been nationalised at one time or another is shown. The list is by no means complete. In very general terms, the pattern for successive Labour governments was to take industries into public ownership. The pattern for the Conservative governments was to restore them to the private sector. Before privatisation, it should be noted that the public sector of nationalised industry only ever involved about 8% of the labour force. The debate about public ownership is one about the merits of central planning, whether they are a way of moving away from capitalism and towards socialism, whether there is a need for so-called natural monopolies, and whether any government should be concerned with propping up ailing industry. In general, the debate is now moving away from public ownership of industry and more towards systems of taxation and social security as a means of achieving social welfare. How did public industry determine prices and investment policies? The map shows the short-run marginal cost curve and the demand curve. The efficient output level is OQ units at a price OP. The producer surplus is shown by HPE. The consumer surplus is PDE, the maximum net benefit being equal to the sum of these. Output OQ should maximise social benefits. This is fine in the short run, but how does the industry then determine when to invest in additional capacity? In the long run, marginal cost includes adding to capacity. On this basis, price should be set to equal long-run marginal cost. When optimum capacity is reached, then the price equal to SMC will also be equal to LMC. However, if the industry is not operating at optimum capacity, then the rules P equals SMC and P equals LMC will not be consistent. The map shows long-run average costs falling and a demand curve DD. The initial position at SMC giving output Q at price P. But here SMC exceeds LMC. Additional capacity should then be constructed until SMC equals LMC, giving output Q1 at price P1. In other words, investment needs to take place. If the SMC were less than LMC, then capacity should be reduced. We call this a process of disinvestment. Implementing marginal cost pricing can be difficult. In the example shown on the map, the LMC is below LAC. Marginal costs are below average costs. Quantity Q is being produced at price P. There is a loss equal to the area PTJE. It occurs because the industry is charging a price below average cost. It means the industry cannot generate sufficient revenue to replace worn-out plant or buy new equipment. If the deficit is financed through money raised by taxation, then there is misallocation of resources. With the electricity industry, there is a problem of determining how to meet demand when consumption varies considerably over a period of 24 hours. A similar problem arises with transport when commuting means full trains and buses at certain times and very few passengers at others. Most of the industry that was publicly owned has now been returned to the private sector through privatisation schemes. In some cases, the whole industry was sold at once. In other cases, it was done in stages. It is argued that since the industry is then accountable to shareholders, it will become more efficient. The sale also means a reduction in public sector borrowing requirement for industry that was operating inefficiently. However, for those that were making a profit, there is a loss of revenue. Concerns still arise about whether the privatized industry always acts in the public industry. There have been criticisms about the loss of rural transport and the failure to provide good communications in rural areas for the internet. It is also argued that we are creating monopolies in privatization. Some criticism also took place at the time with the initial valuations of some of the industry that was being privatized. This ends the last podcast on the public sector, brought to you by Park Bench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. Thank you for watching and for listening. We wish you success in your studies. For further information about Park Bench Tutors, please visit parkbenchtutors.com.